Good morning. So, let's talk a little bit about a concept that you will hear a lot of developers talk about, especially when it comes to refactoring code or handling a legacy code base. Now, the concept is called the rewrite, or if more accurately, the big rewrite. And I wanted to touch on a little bit about why I think that this is very rarely a good idea. Now, let's just define some stuff first and foremost. The big rewrite, or like per my definition and the definition that I've seen most developers use to describe it, is when you get the idea in your head that a code base is so bad and so horrible that you need to rewrite the whole thing from scratch, or a very, very large chunk of said program or said software. And see, the reason why developers feel this is usually because they're working on some part of this large system, and there's a lot of frustration and hassle in terms of, adding new features or maintaining features, or maybe the software is really, really unpredictable and like it misbehaves and all that stuff. So you get this idea, this genius idea, that now you're going to rewrite all these things, and this time you're gonna do it right. You're gonna do it right. Promise. You're gonna make it work this time. This time, or you're gonna write the exact same code, and you're gonna write it in such a way that all of these problems magically disappear. And as you may suspect, this is very, 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 very rarely the case. In fact, it is much more likely that you will do what usually happens when you do the big rewrite. You usually find yourself, sorry, it's very noisy out here. You usually find that what you do is that you rewrite a section of the code that you are very in tune with. When just by freak accident, usually that part that you are rewriting is the same part of software that triggered, or rather that part that you were working on when you had the idea to do the big rewrite. Imagine that. And then you start working on that part that you wanted to, that made you want to rewrite everything, and you make it work for sometimes fairly well, and you feel you feel maybe a little bit satisfied with yourself. And then you realize that, hey, this part here is tied into another part of the system that's also part of the grand whole of everything, and that part you're not so familiar with, and you start trying to make that a nicer experience, or you're trying to, usually what happens is you try to fit these bits that you haven't really looked at all that much into this new, beautiful, perfect poetry of a code that you're writing, and it doesn't really fit. So you make a compromise. You tweak things a little bit, just so that, because, there was an exception there, or there was something going on there that wasn't really the way you thought it was. And then you make a small change here and a small compromise there, and then after a few days you're finished with that part. And now you then take a look at, your new code, and you say, well, okay, I couldn't really get this perfect, this part over here, but it's good enough. I mean, at least the stuff that you originally set out to rewrite is working in a much better way, and now you're going to be so much more productive and feel better about yourself, because that's usually what it's all about. Don't kid me. Very, very rarely when I work on a project and I hear somebody talk about a rewrite, it's actually going to, it's usually about your mental state than anything else. You want things to work in a certain way, and so you rewrite it because it doesn't work in the way that you want it to work. But then, like, so now you're pretty happy with your code. It's a fairly decent code base now, and you feel glad. And then you start the system, and maybe everything runs fairly well. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does. And maybe just a few days later, there's a bug report, and you go and investigate. And now you see that there's something misbehaving in that part of the system that you rewrote. And you kind of go, okay, let's dive in. That's not a problem. We kind of, we're professional, so we kind of expected that, if we change something, there might be a bug. That's a risk we were willing to take because we have rewritten this, and we know that at the end of all of this is going to be all worth it. So you start investigating the bug, you solve it, and you realize that the reason why the bug is there, hopefully, was because you made a small error. And then another bug comes in, and then another, and another, and all of a sudden you realize that you actually did, you introduced more than a few regressions due to this rewrite, because things were working in a very certain type of way, because the specifications and the people who wrote these features, when they were fresh in their minds, had a completely different understanding of how things should be working. And when you came in from the absolute worst situation for you, which is where you basically just looked at the code that they wrote and looked at the way that the code was written, and then you rewrote it, you did not have fresh in your mind all that information and all the specification and limitations. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. The good part is that you could see that, well, this was very poorly written. The bad part is what you're figuring out right now, that there were all these different cases and exceptions and limitations that actually made the code look the way it looks. And this is something, it's very important for you to understand this. Very, very often, when you feel the need to rewrite something, it's not because the code is bad. It's doing what it's doing most of the time for a reason. There are absolutely situations where you can optimize things, and I'm not saying that all code that is written has purpose and meaning and is really, really perfect or even well written for that matter. But usually what you see is that you rewrite things more because they don't look the way you want them to look, or they don't behave the way that you want them to behave. And that's you enforcing or pushing your own coding styles and practices on the project. You are not trying to, and just let's be honest here, and I've done it so many times myself. You are rewriting this not because the code is bad. You're rewriting it because it's not written in the way that you want it to be written. And the danger when you do that in a big rewrite is that, for the most part, let's say that you migrate from React to Angular, or you change your server-side implementation to something new. What you usually find is that your big rewrite, all it's going to do is it's going to leave you with two things. It's going to leave you with a section with the code base that is written in the way that you prefer, and it's going to leave you with regression bugs or bugs, because it takes a while to get everything right. Software development is actually that tricky. So anytime you make a change, especially the larger change you make, the more bugs you usually have. And so you will ultimately find what most people find, and that is that once you did this, when very few people actually measure this, all you actually think about is that you feel a little bit happier about now things are nice, but you don't look at the time it took to make this and the productivity that you got from it. Very few people actually, because that, let's remember, right? If you want to rewrite something, there has to be a value to it. There has to be a good reason for you to do that. And if your only reason for doing it is that you feel better inside, I think that's a very bad reason. It's a really poor reason. I mean, if you're not getting more productive or anything like that, usually it's not worth it, because you are, by doing this rewrite, as I said, like very often you're risking a lot of regression bugs and damage for the users or the product, and you take that risk to do the big rewrite, and therefore the big rewrite has to be very, very carefully thought out. I would say that the rule of thumb for the big rewrite is, if you have a situation, and this is like the only real situation where I really think it does make sense, if you have a project where the code has been neglected for so long that people really struggle, like you see that it's very difficult on average to add features or change the system, and nobody really knows how the system works, and I have been on a few of those projects, then absolutely, then you should do the rewrite. You should have a look at it, and because then you know that if you update the system and make these changes, then going forward will be much easier for anybody involved in the project. But you should at no point think rewrite or do the big rewrite unless that is the situation, because you will most likely only think about the problems that you are sitting with right now. There's usually just a piece of code that you think are a section of code that is so ugly that you want to rewrite the whole thing. And trust me, that risk is really, really, really not worth taking. It's much healthier to have an approach where you add new practices to the project, and story by story, as you move along, you transition code into a nicer way of working.